Hello, and welcome to the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press. My name is Adam, and I'm one of the producers on the pod. Before we get started with today's topic, I want you to imagine the time you'd save if you had classroom assessments that mark themselves. Assessments that adapt to every student's abilities and aptitudes. I'm talking about testing that's suitable for all ages with the power to reveal individual strengths and struggles. This technology frees you to teach, gives you more insight than ever before, and allows you to set motivational goals for each of your students. Sound good? Okay, stop imagining. What I've just described are baseline assessments from the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. If you're interested in learning more, go to cem.org. That's CEM.org. Okay, let's get on with the pod.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press. I'm Silvia Pirola and I will be your host for today. If this is the first time that you listen to our podcast, the Brighter Thinking Pod, well, this is a podcast that has been created to support teachers from around the world. Each episode brings you a lot of advice and conversation from our brighter thinkers, that is to say, authors, teachers and academics, and we hope that there will be a little bit of entertainment on the side as well. During the episode, we will reference books, websites, and resources. Don't worry about writing this down. There will be links and information in the show notes. And if you want to get your voice heard on the show, you can get in touch on Twitter using the hashtag BrighterPod, or you can email us at educationmarketing@cambridge.org. Today, we're going to take a closer look at metacognition, which I know is a term that sounds a bit abstract, but don't be put off quite yet because this conversation will be fantastic. You will learn a lot of very practical and applicable strategies that will help you in your day-to-day job. And I'm joined by three guests, by Dr. Sandra Maguire, who is an internationally renowned learning strategist and a professor emerita of chemistry emerita at Louisiana State University in the United States. Welcome, Dr. Maguire.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And we're also joined by Tom Healy, who is an IB diploma and MYP English teacher at the Ostrava International School in the Czech Republic. Hi, Tom.
Hello, thank you.
And finally, we have Suzanne Dodassia, who is an IGCSE and A-level math teacher at Brussels International Catholic School in Belgium. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you very much. Hello, Silvia. Happy to be here.
Thank you all. Before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about how we got to know each other. Tom and Suzanne are two panelists that are part of our online market research community called the Cambridge Panel. And to thank teachers for all their participation over the years, over the months, we offer professional development webinars. And in March 2021, we were joined by Dr. Maguire, who gave us a fantastic webinar talking about metacognition and all the strategies that she would suggest using to help students learn how to learn. Now that you know how we got to know each other, I would like you to get to know our guests a little bit better. So I'll start by asking a bit of a personal question, perhaps, starting with Sandra. Can you tell me who was your favorite teacher when you were at school?
I would say my favorite teacher was my high school algebra teacher. And she was my favorite because it was very clear that she cared about whether each of us learned. She was very strict, though. She was very demanding. So she had very high standards, but she gave us enough support so that we could meet the high standards that she had. And I reconnected with her after about 50 years and took her out to lunch to thank her for everything that she did for us back then.
Oh, that's so sweet. So good. How about you, Suzanne?
So my favorite teacher is a teacher I had in grade 6 who was very young, very enthusiastic, and started the first lesson with teaching us a song. She was very lively and very enthusiastic. And, I just lessons with her and was, fascinated. And she prepared us for the secondary school very well. So that was my favorite teacher.
Lovely. How about you, Tom?
It turns out my favorite teacher is also from the 6th grade. She was my reading teacher, and she just recognized that I really love to read. And she was the first person to put books into my hands that weren't things I was already reading. She introduced me to authors, age appropriate authors. And she encouraged me with writing and other things too. But I just always felt a connection with her. And she gave me a reason to want to keep reading and keep learning. And I just always felt really passionate about things. I think more after she was my teacher. I felt like she saw me, and it was a unique experience.
That's so wonderful and inspiring. Well, my Italian and Latin teacher was my favorite teacher, and I would say that it's for a very similar reason. She just got me to read pretty much everything, and I love that.
Super.
Great. Now that we are ready to start, so we'll start with an introduction to metacognition, and in particular, Dr. Maguire will explain what metacognition is and why it is important. So, Sandra, over to you.
Yes, metacognition may sound like a fancy term that's difficult to understand, but that's really not true at all. It's a term that was coined by cognitive psychologist John Flavel back in 1976. And simply put, it means thinking about your own thinking. Now, there are a lot more sophisticated definitions than that, but when I talk with students, I want to use the simplest language possible so that they can intuitively understand what it means. So when I'm talking with students, I tell them that it's sort of like you have a big brain outside your brain looking at what your brain is doing. And that big brain is asking your brain questions, and it's saying, do you really understand this information, or did you just memorize it last night because the test is today? And so when you really understand the information, your big brain helps you understand that, well, you'd be able to explain that. You'd really be able to teach it to someone else if you really understand it. And so when you use metacognition, you can really be consciously aware that you're a problem solver. So when issues come up, when problems come up that maybe before you felt that you had to ask someone else for the answers, your metacognitive brain lets you know that you can really think about this and come up with some answers yourself. Now, you still have to talk with people to get information, but you will have done the thinking that you need to do before you speak to someone else. So you really make a transition from being a passive student to being a proactive learner, and you gain the ability to plan, to monitor, and to control your mental processing. And so you keep track of what works and what doesn't work. It gives you the ability to accurately judge your level of learning. And so I'll give you an example of a metacognitive strategy, and that's self-testing. Now, students who are not using metacognition may feel very confident that they know material that they've read and reread, but they haven't tested themselves on it to confirm that they really know it. Now, students who are metacognitive realize that they have to test their understanding before they can really know whether or not they've learned the material deeply. So they'll make practice quizzes, or they'll make self-tests, or they'll practice teaching the material to either a stuffed animal or an imaginary friend or even an empty chair. And so I tell students that any audience that you can use to test your understanding is going to be fine, because if you get stuck when you're trying to teach the material, if you get stuck on certain parts of it, that's your clue to go back and study that more to make sure that you understand it. And without that self-testing, you'll arrive at a test thinking, okay, I know this stuff because I studied it sometimes all night last night, only to get to the test or quiz and look at the first question and realize, oh, I don't think I know this as well as I thought I did. So metacognition puts you in a really great position to really master the material that you're learning, and also to feel very confident that you really understand it.
Right. Okay, so let me just get this straight. Metacognition sounds like a very difficult term, and perhaps it makes it a bit daunting for students and maybe teachers as well. But in reality, it's quite a simple concept. It means thinking about what your brain is doing when you're learning new information, and kind of judging if the brain is actually actively engaged with the information, if it has fully understood it. So I guess it feels like what we're trying to do here is getting students to think at a higher level. But what I'm curious to hear from you, Dr. McGuire, is how can we help them to make that jump to a higher level of thinking?
That's a great question. And to go back just a little bit about the term that might seem to be a little bit scary for students, I was very pleasantly surprised to find that they really love the term. And I use that term instead of, we used to talk about study skills, but I find that students, especially at the higher level, if they've been doing very well, they don't want to hear about study skills. They think they're very good at it already, but they're fascinated by the term metacognition. And there are teachers who teach students as low as third grade, teach them the term and teach them to point to their brains when they're using metacognition. And so it really isn't as daunting to students as we might think it would be. Now, in terms of getting them to move to higher levels, I have found that the best way to do that is, first of all, to let them know that levels exist. And Bloom's taxonomy is a way of classifying levels of learning. It is a tool that was developed by Bloom, a cognitive psychologist at the University of Chicago, Benjamin Bloom and colleagues. And it essentially classifies different levels of learning. There's 6, starting with just remembering, straight memorization, going up to understanding, where now you can explain information in your own terms, to application, where now you can use that information to answer questions, solve problems you've never seen before, and then analysis, where you can take any term and break it into simpler terms, any term or any concept, and explain how they fit together, understand and explain how they fit together. And then after analysis is evaluation, where you can look at 2 ideas, 2 theories, 2 concepts, and determine whether one is more likely to be correct than another. And then the highest level is creation, where now you can come up with your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own theories. And when I talk with groups of students, I will often ask them, have you ever heard a teacher say something like, you're at a higher level now. This is a higher grade. We operate higher here. You've got to move your learning to higher levels. And students always say yes. And then when I ask those students, what do you think those teachers mean? They really have no idea, but they'll say things like, oh, they mean that the work is going to be harder this year than it was before. They'll say they mean that they're going to give us more work. And I said, yes, all of those things are true. But then I asked students if they know what Bloom's taxonomy is, if they've even ever heard of it. And most students have not heard of it. And when I show them the taxonomy, which is just the classification of the learning levels and how each level fits with the other, then I can see the light bulbs going on in students' heads. And it's like, oh, and the most common reaction I get when I teach students about Bloom's taxonomy is they'll say, wow, I wish I had known about this earlier. And it just puts a framework around the different levels of learning that really allows them to see, if I've only been memorizing, then that's at the lowest level. So I've got to do some things to make sure that I'm looking at the big concept. I see how things fit together, and I should be able to come up with my own ideas about how I might come up with a new theory about this information. And that's what Bloom's taxonomy is all about. So, and I think once students understand that levels exist, that's the first step to helping them move themselves to higher levels. And the interesting thing about Bloom's taxonomy is it can really be taught at all levels, because I actually have a friend who teaches third grade, and she found a diagram of Bloom's taxonomy that has birds. And the students really love identifying at what level of Bloom's the questions that she's asking them are. And they just they talk about how many birds there are or what level it is. So even the youngest kids really love learning about Bloom's taxonomy. And it's true that some students already have strategies that are at the higher levels. A lot of students don't, but some students have, based on the experience that they've had at lower grades. And so if there's students in class who are demonstrating that they are learning at higher levels and they have effective learning strategies, then we could ask them to explain how they study to their peers. And when they do this, the students who aren't doing well, the students who are operating at the lower levels, actually recognize that their poor performance, they may not have been performing well on tests or quizzes, and then they realize that their poor performance isn't due to any lack of ability, but it's just due to the fact that they were operating at lower levels of Bloom's, and they can now move to higher levels to effectively learn the material.
This sounds like such a great idea. I feel like it's really helpful on different levels because first of all, it engages those students who already have good metacognitive strategies, and it makes them realize why they're successful in their studies. But at the same time, it also gives new techniques to other students, and on top of that, the confidence to use the techniques, because I guess that if it's a peer who is explaining them how to do something, and their peer shows that they can use the strategies, then why wouldn't they be able to use them too? So it sounds like a really good idea to implement in the classroom.
That's exactly how it works.
And going back to the idea of explaining Bloom's taxonomy to students, I know that it is something that Tom and Suzanne have both tried to use with their classes. So I'd like to hear about your experience, starting with Tom.
Okay. Well, I had the same reaction that you all did when Sandra just gave us the idea to teach Bloom's to our students. It was kind of a revelation, and it just seemed, of course, why don't we do this? So I went ahead and did that. I wanted to see how it would work. I had known about Bloom's before, but only sort of vaguely. I hadn't really thought about it much. I had a poster of it on my wall, and I couldn't even tell you what the levels were at that time. But after Sandra's talk, I really internalized it. It had meaning for me. So I had a mini lesson with my students in my MYP5 class about this. And MYP5 would be about the equivalence of grade 10 in the American system. So grade 10 or 11 students. And I just introduced them to it and kind of explained the way Sandra does about the different levels. And I think what was really important was showing it to them, for them to be able to see that pyramid and not just hear about it, being able to visualize these levels and how one foundation supports another, right? Remembering the knowledge supports the understanding of it. That supports the application of it, and on and on. And I almost immediately saw a difference in the level of engagement from nearly every student, including those who were not very talkative in class, but also even from those who were. And I'll give an example on just one of these students. He's a bright student who was not afraid to speak up in class, but was never really achieving the marks that I think he was always expecting to get, and I thought he was capable of. Neither of us really had the tools to understand why, and we didn't communicate very well about it. In the MYP system, we work on an 8-point scale. So 8 is the highest mark, and 1 then, of course, is the lowest. And he was often in the 3 or 4 or maybe 5 range, turning in his work on the different assessment criteria. And I just sort of thought it was an attitude problem with his. He was overconfident and didn't put in that much effort to understanding what the task was. When I showed him in the class Bloom's taxonomy, and we were doing this was all online during the lockdown, but even through the video, I could see that light bulb turn on it. And all of us teachers know this experience of when you see your student get something. And it wasn't just him. I saw a few of the other students, but really with him, it was like his screen brightened. And from that point on, he started getting 6s and 7s and 8s because he now understood why he was getting 3s and 4s and 5s. He was able to connect that with just the lower levels. He was only ever showing me that he understood the material, that he had read the book, that he knew what was in it, but he wasn't applying any of that to any real thinking. This was also a revelation for me because I had not realized how abstract a lot of these terms are to students, the terms that we use in our assessment criteria. Analyze, evaluate, and most students can't tell you the difference between those two. But there is a big difference between them. And inquire, describe, compare, and contrast, I sort of took it for granted that they just knew what this meant. And while I would talk to them about the nature of the task, I never took the time to define these terms. But now they had this Bloom's taxonomy to identify the terms with. and what level was expected from them. Um, I saw a lot of quieter students become more vocal and engaged in that MYP5 class after that. And it's hard for me to say that there was anything else other than just letting them in on this pedagogical secret that we have. Before that, they felt excluded, I think, from the learning process almost. And after that, it was like they were a part of it. They had this inside knowledge now, and they knew what was expected of them more than anything. They knew what was expected. So I began encouraging my colleagues to do the same thing, so that they could see the framework across the disciplines. And I discovered then that a lot of my colleagues were like me before. They were aware of Bloom's, had a vague understanding of it, but nobody really considered it very deeply as part of the practical learning experience. We had always seen it as a teaching tool, but not a learning tool. And reversing that, turning it into a learning tool, it really made a difference in that class.
Thank you, Tom. This is so enlightening. I really enjoyed listening to you talking about, especially that one student, and seeing his face when he realized he had now the power to learn, and to make sure that he had understood what he was learning. And it's so great to hear that your MYP class really took the concepts on board, and yeah, you just managed to see improvements straight away. Susanne, you also mentioned sharing Sondra strategies with your students and your colleagues. Can you tell us a bit about how that went in your school?
So, as I told you, I've discovered this metacognition and Bloom's taxonomy scale. I discovered that when I listened to the lecture from Sondra Maguire, and it was a revelation. I was like, because since I'm teaching, and this has been a very long time, I was always aware that understanding has levels. You know, you first are able to copy what is being done on the board, then you're able to, do it by yourself, and then you are able to explain it to somebody. And this was very obvious, for example, for physics. When you are learning physics, then you can totally understand the theory of it, how the mechanics work, and then you are faced with a problem and you have no idea on how to solve it, right? So I used to tell my students, just repeat, copy, just don't worry about understanding right now, just do the same. Repeat, 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 and at one point you will get it. You understand? So when I saw this scale, this was brilliant and I really loved it. So the first thing I did is I actually showed the full lecture of Sondra to my students. That was after the exam in June, and we had nothing much to do. So I showed this lecture and the students were all fascinated. It's like 15 to 18 years old students sitting there, just being very, very attentive throughout the whole lecture and very, very interested. So that was my very first experience. And now, since school has started in September, I have been applying it in class. So what I have done with my students, so I have students from age 14 to age 18. So the first thing we did in class was to define what was metacognition, what it meant. And then I had them copy the Bloom's taxonomy scale in their notebook, because I have experienced that having to write it yourself is more thorough than just like looking at it, right? And since I'm teaching math, drawing triangles could be something motivating, or pyramids or something like that. So that's the first thing we did, was to copy this scale and discuss every level, what they meant. Now, the next thing I did in class with the students was to go over the study cycle. You see, the study cycle says you should preview your class. So that was a new idea. I don't think one single student I had would preview the next class. Not one. So I actually did the job in class with the students to follow the preview your class with all students. So I said, okay, good. So next chapter we are going to do is chapter number 1. So let's take the first step of previewing, which says skim the chapter, note headings, and boldface words. So that's what we did. We did that in class. We took 50 minutes, went through the whole process so they could have an idea of what they should do to get ready for the next class and have more fun in class. So I cannot say that I noticed any difference in the grades because I have not tested them yet. But what I can say is that they actually pay a lot of attention in class. They seem really interested. They do their homework and they participate very well. And at the beginning of each class, I always spot check students and ask them what the definition of any key term is, to give me an example. And I really push that they actually use being able to explain to somebody else. So I'm very exciting to see the results coming, and I will be sharing the wins with you probably.
Yes, please.
And that's how I'm using this new knowledge now in my classes.
This is great. I'm so glad to hear that you can see how this has been helpful already. You can see your students a bit more engaged, and then in the next few months, please keep in touch to let us know how things go.
There's another thing I wanted to say is usually when I test my students, I start the examination or the test with define, plot term, and give an example. What's the definition of, and give an example, right? So usually students absolutely hate these questions, right? Because they know how to solve a question. Mathematics is not asking for a lot of writing or explaining what you're doing. It's not as demanding as English, French, or biology, where you have to be able to put words together to make sentences that make sense, right? So they usually are able to solve things but don't really know what they're doing, right? So when I ask these questions about define this, give an example of how it works, right? Well, students hate these questions. But now that we've seen together this scale of understanding, they understand that's just like the second step is being able to say what this means and how you use it. So it's very, very basic. So I can see the difference in terms of knowing the terminology, which is really basic. You cannot do any study seriously without knowing the terminology, right? So that's really I'm really happy because it goes in this direction, and I'm very happy about all this because it supports what I already knew or had observed when I was teaching, right? So I just love it.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Well, we've heard some really positive stories about how this is going within the classrooms, and I just wanted to hear if there is anything that was unexpected, anything that didn't quite go to plan when you tried to use these strategies.
Not about Bloom's taxonomy so much, but just about trying to get into metacognition with my students. And hearing Suzanne, I kind of wish I had thought myself just to show Sandra's webinar to my students instead of trying to recreate it myself. When I first heard this, I immediately bought Sandra's book because I realized that there was something in here that was really valuable. And the book is written more or less for college students or for university teachers and professors. But the big takeaway is all the students are saying, why didn't anybody teach me this before? So since I teach high school, I thought, well, I can be that person to teach my students this before. So I got the book and I went through the book and I downloaded the materials and I took Sandra's presentation directly from her, the Metacognition, the Key to Acing Courses, which is available when you get the book. And I thought I would take this to my DP1 class. They are 1 year older than MYP5, but they're part of the 2-year course. That's the diploma program. And it's a rigorous course and it demands a lot from students. And especially in the first year, students really don't get how much is expected of them. And they come back in the second year, and every second year class is always telling the first year class, you have to manage your time better and you have to do this better, but no first-year class ever listens. So I had this first-year class, and I'm their homeroom teacher. So I thought, I'm going to teach them metacognition. I'm going to go in and be the study session hero. And it did not go as well as with the MYP5 class when I just showed them Bloom's taxonomy. And what I mainly wanted to get across to them was just the idea of metacognition, why it's important, and how they can implement it. These were my 3 goals. And over the course of a couple of presentations, I showed them the success stories that were already embedded in the presentation. And, when I thought back to it, I realized that I just jumped in without asking them where they were with their study skills at that moment. At the time, I didn't think about it. And seeing success stories from people who've been written about in a book by somebody they've never met, it didn't click with them as well because it wasn't relating to them. And that was, I think, my first big mistake, is I failed to establish that premise for their need for the metacognition and the study strategies that are involved in that. So this is all, in hindsight, which is always 2020, but I showed them the success stories. I tried to keep the presentation as interactive as possible, getting them to think about and respond to things. But what surprised me the most was how nearly every student felt that they would study harder to get an A on an exam rather than to teach the material. And this is one of the points in the presentation, which is supposed to go the opposite way. Students are supposed to say, well, to teach the material, you have to know it better. You have to have a deeper understanding of it. So you'd have to study it more. But for them, it wasn't important to have to teach it. They could not look past the idea of getting an A. It didn't seem that they were even trying to show an awareness of what teaching the material might actually involve. And they knew that studying to get an A might lead to success on that exam, but would quickly be forgotten. They conceded this point. I found them to be really combative and resistant to the idea of developing deeper understanding over scoring good marks. They just seemed unable or unwilling to link deeper understanding to better marks, that if you have a deeper understanding, that's going to naturally lead to better marks. It's just that the goal-oriented get an A, that was all that really mattered at that moment. It was a strange discussion for me because, again, they were admitting that to teach the material, they would need to understand it better, but they wouldn't try that hard because all that mattered was the marks. But this was also really important for me in my own understanding of what students believe is important. And I think, at the high school level, it's different than at college. Students go to college and their thinking changes. And I think we all remember I remember certainly how my thinking changed when I went to college. But the contrast with my experience with MYP5, I showed them Bloom's taxonomy, and all of them started getting better marks immediately. They were all immediately engaged with the idea of, oh, this is what learning looks like. And my DP students, they fought me at every turn. Well, at least the most vocal students fought me at every turn. I did see a couple students taking notes. I don't know what the results have been from that. But it was an important learning experience for me too, that you have to start at their level with their needs before telling them that this can help them. So yeah, it was a strange day.
This is so interesting, Tom. Thank you for sharing. I think we're all good at sharing all the great things and how when everything goes well and goes positively. But it was perhaps even more interesting to hear about an experience that didn't quite go as you would have expected. So I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Maguire, if you could give us your thoughts on this experience that Tom had.
Tom, I think for your students, and I don't want you to think that you were doing anything wrong, Tom. No, you are not doing anything wrong, because I developed the strategies that I'm using now through trial and error. And so when I look back, there's so many things that I didn't do initially that I'm doing now that it's like I go, oh, why didn't I do that before? Well, I didn't know to do that before. And so I think it's the same thing in your case. And so I think that doing what you did and observing the result is very, very important. So I never want you to think that you're doing anything wrong. You're just doing something to get information. And so I think part of the difference might be in the two classes, where even though there was only about a 1-year difference, students at the higher level are closer to maybe trying to get into university or at the next step. And the closer they get to that next step, the more important they realize that grades are. And sometimes when I talk with faculty, and I'm talking about, get students to focus on learning and not grades. And then when I give all the before and after examples where we're talking about grades, sometimes they'll say, well, you said get them to focus on learning, but all we're talking about is showing them how grades improved. Well, the fact of the matter is students know that grades are the currency in education. And so they know that it's important to get a high grade, but I will ask students to telescope out and see themselves in their career. And then I ask them to tell me the difference that the success someone might be having. If we look at two students, one who memorized things, who got excellent grades in school, and they're at a professional level now, but because they memorized, they have the excellent grades. And Tom, you said that your students realized that the learning would be deeper if they did this, but they were focused on grades. And so I asked, what would be the difference between someone who has learned this deeply, can apply it, as Suzanne emphasizes, and someone who actually concentrated on doing these things to learn the material? What's the difference, do you think, their performance is going to be when they become professionals? And I've actually seen that make a big difference with students, because now they can connect to the fact that if I do this, then I might not necessarily get a better grade, but my long-term goal is not to get the great grades, it's to be the best professional that I can be. And so sometimes just having that discussion, and I just want to say a little bit more about the students who say they would work harder to get an A. Now, sometimes, and when I do this, I really emphasize to students that there are no right or wrong answers, really. And so sometimes when students say, but I would work harder to get a grade, I'll ask them why. And most of them, though, are not doing it for the right thing. They'll say, well, it's my grade, I have to get into college. But some of them say, well, if I'm working to get an A, I know I have to understand it from all different perspectives. I've got to be able to explain things. So some of them who say A are actually doing it the right way. And they'll say, well, if I had to teach it, all I have to do is get up and, with some notes and kind of read the notes. And so just recently, I've started to add, you have to teach it without using any notes or the book. And then sometimes that makes a difference. But I love the challenges that you're having. And part of this is trying to think through what kinds of questions might I ask students? What kind of discussion could I engage them in that will allow them to see what I'm trying to tell them to do that they're not getting? But no, you guys rock, I tell you. I'm just so in awe of you, because I know it's not easy to change, and you've done this with great success. So I really appreciate it. Oh, and I'll say one last thing. I love hearing what teachers say, because you've given me some things. I always hear things I've never heard before. And Suzanne, I never thought about telling students to draw Bloom's taxonomy. And I think that's brilliant to get them to internalize the information. And Tom, when you said that it was almost like the student's screen got brighter.
Lit up.
Yeah, lit up. That was wonderful. And so I can use the examples with other teachers, because a motivating factor, I think, for students and for teachers is to hear how it's worked for other people like them. And then the last thing I'll say is, Tom, you mentioned, or Suzanne, and you mentioned having students look at the lecture. And as Tom pointed out, there are links to the PowerPoints that I used in that presentation in the book. But if you want to see the presentation, if you just Google my name, Sandra McGuire, and metacognition, you will see it's about a 50-minute presentation. And I'm working with a class. And it is often the case, Tom, that when students see that, then they kind of connect with it in a way, because they see how other students are reacting to the information. So you might try that also.
Super.
Yeah, I might give that a go. It won't be just me lecturing them again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to everyone listening, we will put everything in the notes, so don't worry, you will be able to see the presentation, the slides as well. So we're getting towards the end of our conversation, but before we move on, I just wanted to ask if there are any other strategies that you're planning to use in class, Tom and Suzanne, and also Sondra, if there is anything that you would like to recommend to teachers listening that we haven't quite covered yet.
Yeah, for sure. We're at the beginning of the school year, and I would like to say that I've seen several other teachers at my school now teaching Bloom's taxonomy. Our Korean teacher translated it into Korean for her students, some of whom were in my MYP5 class last year, and they came running to me saying, "We got this too in our Korean class."
That's
They were really
excellent.
excited about it. And that's how we started off our year, was drawing it on the board and having the students and talking about them. This is learning, and these are the expectations, and they have that to refer to now. And it's already established at the beginning of the year. And I would like to teach this to more grade levels at our school. And I think if I were to do this again, I would break it into smaller segments, maybe 10 minutes at a time, talk about metacognition one time, and another time talk about the study session skills, the superpower study session. I don't remember what it's called,
Study
but
Study
cycle.
cycle.
the study
Yes.
cycle, which is a fantastic thing, but can get lost if I'm teaching everything all at once. The active reading in another session, which for myself I've also applied. I don't take notes after every paragraph because I teach language and literature, but I'm using that to tell my students, read a chapter and then summarize it and write down whatever questions you have, and then move on to the next chapter. And if nothing else, then it's easier for you to remember, out of all 60 chapters we have to read, where to find the information, right? So a lot of these skills I'm applying to myself now. And yeah, I would like to break it into smaller chunks to introduce it to the wider range of levels across our school, and work with a couple of other teachers and some of the other homeroom teachers about getting students to think about their studying, because nobody teaches them to do this at the high school level. And that's why Sondra had to write this book, because at the college level, they haven't been taught that yet. And I think we can really be instruments of change here. And to respond to what she said about, Suzanne and I taking the steps to introduce this, I had to, because it says in the book, if you don't do this within 48 hours, you probably never will. So, now or never. Why wait for this? It's really magnificent stuff. And yeah, my main goal is to try to link this more clearly to the needs that the students have for their goals and the success in both the short and the long term, and help them see that bigger picture over time.
I'm so excited to hear how this is going to go. So we'll have to catch up again in a few months.
I look forward to that.
What I would like to add, thank you, Tom. What I would like to add is I have had the student copy the study cycle in their notebooks. They the preview the class, and the step attend usually made the student laugh, right? It says like, yeah, go to school, go to class. So they all laugh, as this being needed, obviously. So in almost all my classes, I went through the full study cycle step by step, taking the time, maybe 20 minutes or something, right? And then there's another tool I'm going to use soon, is the effective homework strategy, which I was instinctively using in the past when asking the students to correct the test and find a reason for their error, and find what was the word, the definition they missed, or what they failed to apply correctly. So I think that this effective homework strategy is brilliant. So voila. So these are the three basic tools I'm just gonna use. Repeat, because a lot of teaching gets through when it's repeated. So I'm not afraid of seeing the same thing twice. And if I repeat it enough, the students will think it's important and will use it. So anyways, thank you very much, Sondra, for this brilliant lecture that really, made my teaching life happier.
Oh, well, thank you. And it's interesting. I use metacognition in my own life every day. When I have problems things that I would have asked someone else to help me with before, I now realize that, no, I can figure this out. And so it really makes a difference throughout your life. That's what I love about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. I think we've mentioned a couple of things, the effective homework strategies and the study cycle. Sandra, would you mind giving us a quick overview about this?
Yes. Well, I'll start with the study cycle because Suzanne mentioned that. And it really just gives students a framework to think about what they need to do before class, when they're in class, after class, in order to make their learning more efficient. And so that previewing, and Suzanne described it perfectly, is just getting an overview of what's going to be happening in class the next day. Because we know from the cognitive science literature that if the brain is about to learn something new, if it has a big picture and then it gets individual details to fill in that big picture, it's much more efficient than if it starts getting the individual details trying to create its own big picture. So that preview gives them the big picture. And it also gives them the information they need for when they're in class to really actively participate. And I was struck by what both Tom and Suzanne said about the engagement of the students after they learned about this information. And so now they can be much more actively involved in class. And then the third step is review what happened in class as soon after class as possible, so you can start that information moving from short-term to long-term memory. And then the next phase of it is what they need to do when they're actually sitting down to study. Because so many students have no idea, what does that mean? Nobody ever taught me how to study. And so we show them how to break up those, take a minute or so to set a goal for what they want to accomplish, and then study for 30, 40, 50 minutes using the strategies, maybe making concept maps, practice teaching the information, and then take a short break and come back and review what they've just studied. Because as Suzanne, you're absolutely right in having them hear it more than once, because we say repetition is really the key to learning. And so then when they do that, as they're doing that study cycle and using those intense study, well, we used to call them intense, we now call them focused study sessions, because students told us that intense was too intense a word. And so we changed it to focused study sessions. But it really does give students a very clear view of, after learning about Bloom's and knowing that they really need to be at higher levels, how to master the information in order to get themselves to higher levels. And the other thing that you asked about was the effective homework strategy. And I'm so happy that Suzanne is able to implement that. And basically it involves the idea that most students do, including myself, unfortunately, because I didn't know these strategies either, but we do our homework wrong. When I was given problems to do, homework problems, the first thing I would do is sit down and look at the first problem and then flip back in the chapter to find an example of the problem that I had to solve. And then I would follow the example and mimic the steps to work the problem. And it seemed that everything was very clear. But then when I got to the test or the quiz, then if they changed anything at all around, then I was totally lost, because I wasn't taking any control of really thinking myself about how to solve the problem. I was just following what the author had done. So the effective homework strategy involves, first, after you've studied the information, just reading the problem statement and then working it yourself until you get to an answer. And then just compare your answer with the answer in the book. If you got the same answer, then you can look at what the author did. But if you didn't get the same answer, don't look yet. Try to figure out where your mistake was. And when I talk to students about this and I ask them at this point, is making a mistake good or bad? Students always say making a mistake at this point is good. But faculty always say that students will say bad. But students recognize that when they go through this process and make mistakes, that's really where a lot of the learning occurs. Now, I tell them it's great if they don't make a mistake, but I ask them, if you do make a mistake, why is that good? And then they give me the reasons that it's good. And I love the way Suzanne has really incorporated that into the materials that she's using. And Tom, in terms of courses that may be more social science, it's if they have a homework question, then typically what students would do is they would go back and they would read the section in the text or in their notes that was about this particular question, and then they would answer the question based on what they just read. But in this method, what they do is they study the information first, and then when they have to answer the questions, they answer it themselves without looking back at anything, writing as much as they know to write. Then after they've done that, they compare what they've written to now what's in the book or in their notes to see if there are any things they left out, if there are anything that they put in that might not be correct. And so again, the idea is using homework as a learning tool, as a learning experience, rather than something to just get done and turn in for a grade.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic explanation. So I think we're coming towards the end of the podcast. And if you're still listening, thank you so much for listening. I have one last question for you, Sandra, that is about why there are some students who find metacognitive strategies easier to implement at the begin with without even knowing about metacognition, without even knowing about the Bloom's taxonomy. There are some students who, you said at the beginning, find it easier to have this type of thinking, and some others who instead don't have these techniques yet when they arrive at school. And I just wanted to hear your opinion on why, if you have any hypothesis on why this might be.
It's certainly true that we will see students who exhibit these skills from day one, and other students who seem not to have any idea about what they're supposed to do. And just recently, over the past year, I've coined a term, I call it metacognitive equity. And it refers to the fact that the ability, the experience that students have had really has so much to do with whether or not they are able to do these higher order thinking skills. There's some students, my own kids, for example, went to Montessori school. And in Montessori school, from day one, they're taught that their work is their play. And so they're allowed to come up with ways that they're going to structure things. And so they're being taught the creative process from a very early age, whereas other students throughout their schooling, they're never given the opportunity to think on their own, to analyze things, to create things. And so when they get to the next level, the students who had experience at the lower levels can do this, not because they're any brighter than the students who can't, but because they've just not had the experience to develop those skills. And that's where metacognitive equity for me is when we can close that gap between the thinking skills that different groups of students bring to the environment. And I find that teaching students these strategies are very much like Tom's student, that once they hear it, it's like, okay, I know now what's expected of me. I have tools to accomplish this. And they're excited about trying it because they see what the results might be. And so that's why I love for everyone to understand, which I didn't initially, but I want all of us to understand that some students are not doing so much better because they're inherently brighter than other students. It's just that they've had the opportunity to implement the skills that we're trying to get other students to implement.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all three of you for a fantastic conversation. I enjoyed every second of it. And I hope that's the same for you and for all our listeners. Dr. Maguire, is there anything else that you'd like to add on where people can find more about you and your work?
Yes. Well, the two books, the one for instructors is Teach Students How to Learn. And then the one for students, which I think has been very effective for students of 13, 14, 15, higher, even students in medical school use this. But it is the book that teaches students. I talk directly to students about these concepts. And we wrote that book because after learning that Teach Students How to Learn, there were so many instructors when I'd go speak at their institutions and they'd say, oh, I gave the book to my son and he was making C's and now he's making A's. And so we realized that if we had a book that was written to and for students, as opposed to the book that was written to faculty, to instructors about students, then it might connect very much to students. And so it did. And our third project that I am announcing for the first time publicly is we're writing an edition for parents now.
That's great.
Yeah. Because if parents
Yes.
know about these skills and strategies, and they can teach them to their students, and we're trying to get everyone to recognize, including parents, that if your child is not making high grades, it's not because they're not capable. It's because they haven't learned these skills. And so we're teaching parents how to teach that. And so I think it's going to work very much in conjunction with what's going on with what the teachers do in class. And that's going to be reinforced at home. So, and then if you just Google my name, you'll find examples of lots of presentations and more information.
Thank you. And great news about the new project. Really, really good news. So I guess that's all for our episode on metacognition. If you're listening, please don't forget to tell your friends about us and rate our show on whatever platform you're listening on. Remember again that the show notes will be full of links to everything that we've discussed throughout the show. And please give us a follow on Twitter at CUP Education or use the hashtag BrighterPod to get in touch with us. And once again, you can also email us at educationmarketing@cambridge.org. Thanks again, and goodbye to our fantastic guests.
Goodbye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.